Sean Diddy Combs isn't just fighting for his freedom, he's fighting to hold on to his fortune. Forbes now estimates his net worth is $400 million, a significant drop from the $740 million valuation just a few years ago. But that number could shrink even more. Federal prosecutors are moving to seize assets tied to the alleged criminal activity, and if convicted, Combs could lose everything from luxury properties to his music rights. In response, he's hired one of the best in the business to lead his defense against the government's sweeping forfeiture action. But will it be enough? I'm your host, Kennedi Walker, and you're watching Law and Crime. Once considered a billionaire with a vodka line, a TV network, and a clothing brand, Sean Combs' fortune has taken a major hit. Forbes estimates his net worth is roughly $400 million, nearly half of what it was just a few years ago. Both his Beverly Hills and Miami mansions were raided in March of 2024 as part of the investigation into his alleged crimes. And that number may continue to drop as Combs faces a federal trial and a Justice Department forfeiture action that could cost him his empire. An empire that prosecutors allege was built, at least in part, through a pattern of criminal activity, including alleged sex trafficking, drug distribution, and violence, all used to advance what they call a racketeering enterprise. In the unsealed indictment, prosecutors outline how his business and personal assets allegedly played a role in carrying out or concealing the crimes. This means any assets connected to the behavior, even indirectly, could be seized, including real estate, companies, vehicles, and aircrafts. Now, his $60 million private jet has reportedly already been sold. The Beverly Hills estate is currently on the market for $61 million. And while Combs still owns his $48 million Miami mansion, a judge denied his request to use it as collateral for bond. In week 2 of testimony, Homeland Security Special Agent Gannon took the stand. Gannon, who helped lead the March raids of Combs' homes, walked jurors through photos of the items seized. Among them, parts of AR-15 style rifles with the serial number scratched off, loaded magazines, a Gucci bag reportedly filled with ketamine and MDMA, and personal items like lingerie and dozens of bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Prosecutors say this evidence is critical to establishing the elements required under federal racketeering laws, helping them show a pattern of alleged crime, criminal behavior used to sustain or conceal the enterprise. In an effort to protect what's left of his assets, Combs hired Stefan Casella, former deputy chief of the Justice Department's asset forfeiture and money laundering section, to fight the forfeiture action. If the jury finds Combs guilty, it will be up to them to determine how much of Combs' assets are subject to forfeiture. Anything forfeited after a conviction could be used to support alleged victims. Sean Combs denies all allegations. And to help us break down what's at stake, I'm joined by Jim Trusty. He's the former chief of the Department of Justice, Organized Crime and Gang Section. Jim, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure. Good to be here.
So, Jim, let's start with the forfeiture. This isn't just about prison time anymore. Prosecutors want his empire. From what you've seen in the filings, how aggressive is this?
Well, it looks to be very aggressive, and there's a couple of reasons I say that. The first is it's very broadly worded. What they're talking about is essentially any property, real or personal, that could constitute either facilitating property or instrumentalities, they call it, or proceeds. And so that's kind of the whole business empire of P. Diddy being at risk. And that's the second part, which is it's a RICO case, a criminal enterprise case, where they've defined the organization, the criminal enterprise, as not just Sean Combs, but as all these business interests that he has, including liquor labels, music labels, everything else you can think of. So they've set it up in a way where when they get to a forfeiture phase, if there's a conviction, the sky's the limit, and it looks like they're going to try to take a piece out of him everywhere he's ever touched.
This is a Law and Crime legal alert. If you received Depo-Provera birth control shots and were later diagnosed with a brain or spinal tumor called mesangioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about this risk. It's free to check, takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen, click the link below, or go to forthepeople.com/LC Depot to see if you qualify. Is that normal, though, for the government to file something so broad?
I've seen it before. I mean, in the context of racketeering cases, you tell a much more complete story in a RICO case. You don't just focus on a particular moment in time or a crime. You tell the whole story of this criminal enterprise, which lends itself to big forfeiture moments. And so it's not totally unusual to see it this broadly worded. What I think is a little unusual is it's not very specific in terms of any preliminary seizures. It looks like they haven't actually seized anything yet, even though they executed search warrants and looked for evidence of things. And so a lot of times you'll see listings in there of bank accounts, automobiles, jets, whatever, that the government has already preliminarily seized to make sure it's still going to be available at the time they do a forfeiture hearing. So this one, it's a blank slate. And it's blank enough where if you're the defense attorney and you get to this next phase, which, by the way, is supposed to be with the same jury. They may not know that yet. But that second phase would be one where you really would say to the judge, I don't have any notice here, Your Honor. This is so broadly worded. I need to particularize it, have a chance to digest it, and perhaps bring in expert testimony on both sides about kind of legitimate sources of income versus illegitimate ones.
And you mentioned that, they're also linking his company. So maybe that's his, record studio, or maybe that's, his vodka line. But how does something like a vodka line, how can that potentially even be mixed up with this? How can they say that that's linked to an alleged crime?
Yeah, it's really one of two or maybe even three ways. One is if there's somehow a tie-in where that property, that business was used to facilitate the freak-offs that are in the indictment, for instance, or obstructionist behavior. So if they literally used a record studio for a party and the record studio belonged to one of his companies, you could say that actually facilitated or was an instrumentality to support the criminal conduct. The other way is essentially if it is a proceed, if it was essentially built on money that comes from illegal activity. And then thirdly, and this is where it gets really crazy confusing, so I'll keep it short. Sometimes there's something called substitute assets where the government says, okay, we realize that particular asset, that car, that piece of art was not actually bought by proceeds or served to contribute to the crime. But because we can't find enough to satisfy the overall amount we're owed, we're going to take it as a substitute asset. It's a very government-friendly area, this whole idea of federal forfeiture. And again, I think they're in a position where they might have their mitts on almost anything he's ever touched.
And how do they decide just that number that they're looking for? Is there kind of like a flat out number that the government, when charging with these types of cases, that they say, hey, we're looking for 50 million, we're looking for 60 million? How do they decide how much?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, that is an easier task in some circumstances where you have a fraud situation where you can tell the amount of victimization and say, well, look, it adds up to 2.5 million, and they put that in the forfeiture indictment. They don't have that here. In a drug case, for instance, you might say, well, they were responsible for 10 kilograms of cocaine. A kilogram's about 30,000. So we're looking for 3 million, do the math. Here, it's much more wide open. I think you're looking at an actual trial within a trial if we get to the forfeiture phase, where there's going to be experts saying this is money that's untouched by any sort of criminal enterprise from the defense side, and maybe a forensic auditor from the FBI saying, here's why we're entitled to all these types of proceeds or instruments. So it is a wide open battlefield. It's going to be kind of a textbook example of how deep the government tries to reach for forfeiture if they get to that point.
At what point does that kind of strategy from prosecutors become legally risky for them, though?
That's the thing. I mean, the court of public opinion every now and then turns on forfeiture. And, the idea of forfeiture is that you don't want people to not just get away with crime, but profit from it. Being criminally prosecuted and put in prison doesn't mean that you've lost the assets. And so the idea is to kind of make things even, to hold people accountable, to not let them profit from criminal activity. But over time, you see abuses. You see situations where a person barely had a role in some sort of criminal conspiracy. I mean, literally was on the job for one day and is ordered to forfeit millions of dollars. And that bubbles up to the Supreme Court where they say this is just not totally fair. So there are abuses of the forfeiture system that are seen from time to time. I think, look, if P. Diddy, if Sean Combs is convicted in this case. I don't think he's going to necessarily gin up a ton of sympathy, but there may be legal observers that say, hey, this is a broad, overreaching moment, when they try to collect every single penny that a guy who obviously had legitimate income over long periods of his life.
And for those that do say, hey, isn't this just a financial overreach? How do prosecutors justify that?
Yeah, I think they justify it by saying, in this case, they'll say, look, two things. Number one, we didn't disable him financially pre-trial. We haven't actually locked into his accounts and taken things and frozen things where it might even affect his ability to hire attorneys or hire experts. And secondly, they say, look, it's a criminal enterprise that extended for a number of years, that where he had financial profit from this kind of power and control over an enterprise. So I don't expect them to be apologetic. I mean, they may end up showing moments of moderation where they say, well, we're not going to go after this company or that company, but they've left it all on the table for now, where they can do a very broad, deeply reaching process if they want to.
And Sean Combs, he's already sold one jet. The Beverly Hills mansion of his is on the market for 61 million or so. Does that seem like someone who is confident that they'll walk, or could that work for or against him in court?
It's probably not going to be anything that's particularly admissible during the trial. It could come up during the forfeiture just to show that his overall stock has dropped. I mean, I think he's down to his last 400 million. It's a real tough spot to be in. But but I think at the end of the day, you really can't draw any firm conclusions. He knows he's got a battle of his life going on right now. I mean, this is a life eligible racketeering case. Doesn't mean he'll necessarily get life. It's not a mandatory sentence. But if the facts are continue to be established of years of abusive and controlling behavior, it paints a pretty dark picture for him in terms of sentencing.
And Sean Combs, he's now brought in Mr. Casella, someone who literally wrote the book on asset forfeiture. What's Casella's role likely to be here?
Well, I worked with Steph at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland for years. He is literally the expert on forfeiture. Whenever I have a situation in private practice where I have a question mark about forfeiture, that poor guy has to take my phone call. So he's a great pick. He knows what he's doing. He knows both the process and the law, which can be a little bit different sometimes. I think he's probably, getting them prepared for the types of challenges. And by the way, I don't know this from him, but I would guess that he's basically figuring out what are the types of challenges we could raise in a forfeiture phase. What are the deficiencies in the government's approach? In other words, are they not discounting lawful employment by Sean Combs? And frankly, some of it could even relate to like how he's spending money right now. When you have a broad forfeiture allegation, it's kind of hard to figure out, are they saying that I can't get attorneys of my choosing because I'm using proceeds of criminal activities? So I think he's probably giving a lot of very sage guidance on how they walk through this process of dealing with a very broad, very deep, potentially deep-reaching forfeiture.
Since he is so knowledgeable, and since, I don't know if there's anyone who's more knowledgeable than him in this specific department, do you think that bringing him in may challenge the government's playbook at all?
I think it would certainly give them a moment of pause. Look, the reality is there's probably not a ton of time being spent worrying about forfeiture quite yet. They're probably figuring we'll get there when we get there. We got to try to get a conviction. But yeah, it's a shot across the bow. You see Steph Casella lining up on the other side, and you can say this about a lot of different type of expert witnesses and things where you say, wow, that's the king of DNA or the queen of forensic fingerprint recovery. So, I think it's a shot across the bow. They'll realize that they've got somebody that really knows their stuff on the other side, but that doesn't necessarily mean they change their approach in any way at this point.
And there's this idea of facilitating property, that a business or maybe an item helped enable a crime. How direct does that link need to be?
Yeah, we should ask Steph. but yeah, that's a great question. You have to be able to show, a significant link. It can't be just like this 6 steps removed kind of thing. Like there was a bottle of liquor that happened to be on the bar during one of these assaults, and he owns a liquor company, so therefore, the liquor we can presume facilitated the crime. You're going to have some, quantum of proof that's deeper than that. But it's very fact specific, and again, that's why I think you're probably looking even though a lot of times forfeiture becomes a very small afterthought to a criminal trial, this one really has the potential to be a completely independent kind of mini trial, delving into his finances, delving into issues just like that, like how well connected can the government make these instrumentalities, these facilitating pieces of property. I think it's inherently pretty difficult, but again, if you use a location, that's a little bit easier. If you say I'm going to use my liquor company headquarters, or I'm going to use a record business studio to have one of these freak offs, that becomes a much tougher climb for the defense to get out of it as an instrumentality. It's these kind of third time removed ones where they might have some success.
And like how you said, we're not just talking about past behavior here. Prosecutors say that this was ongoing. Does that make asset recovery just a little bit easier for them?
Yeah, in general, I'd say yes. I mean, because you're talking about a period of years, and you're going to have, during these trials, you're going to have very specific stories from witnesses that say, I was there when X happened at this particular location. But you're probably going to get broad characterizations too. Like he would always, use his liquor to get people drunk before these freak offs. Or there were times where we met and discussed how we were going to do this at office X or home Y, or how planes were used. It might not be a specific moment, but he might have somebody that says, I was at the airport when his private plane brought prostitutes here. So you might not have the precision that you'd have with kind of a single event trial, but you're probably going to have pretty significant stories that, again, tie these properties into the possibility of being forfeited.
How much of a role does public perception play here? I mean, have we seen the DOJ make strategic decisions based on headlines?
Well, overall, sure. We could probably point to all sorts of cases that you could, I think, fairly characterize as a little bit of trophy hunting, where the Department of Justice or even non-federal prosecutors, think this is my great case, and they like the headlines that come with it. But look, I don't think this is an example of a case that's being brought in bad faith. I think it's unusual to see a one-person RICO. It's not legally impossible. You can talk about the enterprise as being broader than the individual. And I think tactically, these are pretty smart prosecutors. I think what we should be watching for over the next few weeks are witnesses that come in as cooperating defendants who have pled to RICO conspiracy. I think that's still to come. And even though it's really not supposed to work this way, a jury takes some comfort from that. Like, there's other people that admit that this was a criminal enterprise and that they were part of it. They're actually usually instructed to not draw that conclusion at the expense of, like Sean Combs in this case. But that's a hard thing. You hear three or four people go, yeah, I was a part of a criminal group. It makes it a little bit easier on some level for them to convict the target of that particular trial.
Well, two questions here as a follow up. When you say, some people may come on the stand and say, "Yeah, I was a part of that group," does that count like as like a former assistant or some sorts? Because I know one of his former assistants took the stand and said that he set up, he allegedly set up some drugs for Sean Combs in his hotel rooms, or he provided this or he provided that. Does that count, or are we looking for more of a smoking gun?
Well, what I'm saying is tactically, it's going to be helpful for them to have people that don't just have the inside stories like that, the one you just gave, but that actually say, I'm here under a plea agreement where I've pled guilty to RICO conspiracy. It just sends kind of this emanation to the jury that this is a fairly charged case because these other people have literally put their lives on the line by pleading guilty to it. So, again, most of the witnesses that I'm aware of at this point fall into the category of victims or kind of pure witnesses. But I think you're going to see some people that are, maybe more extensively involved, more knowingly involved in some of the terrible things that happen. And they come in and say, I've eaten this plea myself as a condition of my testimony.
Right. And we still have weeks left to go. So I'm sure the government may be bringing this up later on. But going back to the jury, at the end of the day, if Mr. Combs is convicted, who gets the final say on what's seized? Is it the jury? Is it the judge?
Yeah, it's actually the jury. I mean, I've had trials before where the jury, when I was a prosecutor, where the jury would convict. They come out of the jury box, jury room to the jury box, and they're holding on to their pocketbooks and their books and their notepads, thinking it's Friday, we're finally going to get to go home. And the judge says, by the way, there's a second part to this trial. And they learn the hard way that the forfeiture actually falls on them. Now, sometimes the forfeiture is kind of self-contained within the guilt innocence. There's not a whole lot to do but argue how much money should be taken from the defendant. But I think this is a case where they're actually going to probably have testimony and stretch their service out a little bit by having this kind of mini trial. Again, they make the decision. Now, sometimes when things have gone badly and you're the defense and you say, we just got convicted of RICO conspiracy, how much do I want this jury to control my life? You can make a run at having a bench trial on forfeiture. You can also try to settle it, but if you want to contest it, you can say, look, Mr. Prosecutor, Mrs. Prosecutor, let's just have the judge handle forfeiture, and they will always agree to that. And then you have kind of a pared down, more legalistic type approach, which is just a judge helping calculate what the forfeiture amount should be and the sources of that forfeiture.
And realistically here, when we're talking about just the assets that could get seized, could Mr. Combs go bankrupt over this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in some ways that feels like the intention of the government when they have something that's so broadly worded. Now, they didn't put a price tag. They didn't say we're looking for $400 million, but but the import of this forfeiture allegation shouldn't be understated. I mean, he is looking at dire straits if he's convicted, not just in terms of imprisonment, but because they're going to go hard after all these assets.
Yeah, very ironic coming from a rapper that had a song called All About the Benjamins. So, but I do have a question. Let's flip it here. What if Mr. Combs is acquitted on the major charges? Can he still lose parts of his estate?
He could, but it would really start to smell like an overreach by the government. And the only reason why I'd say he could is legally, you have a different standard, a different burden of proof. The criminal trial is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that he's violated the law on racketeering. Forfeiture is actually a preponderance of evidence. It's a civil matter, even though it's tapped into a criminal indictment. And so, I think the reality is you could, if you're a prosecutor, you could say, well, we know he was acquitted, but we still want to make a run at it. I think it's not going to go well if they try to do that. The practice typically is you lose the trial, you lose the forfeiture allegation, you're done. So I really think that's how this plays out, even though there might be some legal argument that you could still have a forfeiture proceeding after not guilty. It's all tied into the conviction practically.
And is it harder, to defend against forfeiture in a RICO case versus something more straightforward?
I mean, it always depends a little bit on the strength of the evidence, right? If you've got somebody who is identified as the money launderer for, a drug trafficking cartel, and the jury sees the planes, trains, and automobiles that he owns and knows he has no legitimate source of income, those can be pretty devastating forfeiture moments and very hard to defend. Here, you at least have the murkiness of legitimate income to kind of play with when it comes to Sean Combs or P. Diddy, more accurately for that part. So look, at the end of the day, it's going to be tough. They have the best advice they can get on the defense side with Steph Casella, and I expect you'd see expert testimony and some pretty tough decisions. But again, if he's convicted, I'd say it's probably about 2-1 that the defense says, let's get past this jury that just convicted him and let's deal with the judge. And that tends to go well for the government when it's a judge deciding forfeiture after a conviction.
Hypothetically, could Mr. Combs start putting some of his assets in, I don't know, let's say his mother's name, his children's name?
Not uncommon. That's kind of the first thought of a lot of fraudsters is like, how do I shield this stuff? And it doesn't usually work. If it's transparently a transaction done for that purpose to kind of divest yourself of a potential forfeiture, the government can still make a run at that. It might have been something that he did historically that would be smart and it would have a better chance of shielding it. But once you're under the hook of the government's case and of the jurisdiction of the court, those types of transactions become much more difficult to pull off. Now, again, to my knowledge, there's no freezing order. So he does have the literal capacity to move assets around to deal with things. But I wouldn't expect the government to be so asleep at the switch that they let last second gifts or transfers really affect what they go after.
Right. So he can't say, "Hey, no, I put this in my son's Christian's name. This home doesn't belong to me. It's for Christian now." That doesn't really work.
Sure, most likely not. I mean, if it happened a long time ago, independent of any investigation, sure. But if it's during the sequence of events from kind of indictment on, it's unlikely that that's going to work.
And last question before I let you go. Can Sean Combs keep fighting this and still stay in the business world? Or is this the kind of case that, I don't know, clears the board?
Yeah, I mean that's really kind of a profound question when you think about it in terms of how society views these things. I mean, look, if the allegations bear out where there was just this kind of hideous abuse of multiple people, mostly women, over a long period of time, that's hard to recover from, kind of politically or socially. But I don't put anything past our country at this point. Our society can be forgiving and can basically say, okay, he did terrible things, but it's time to recognize all the new things that he's done in his life. I don't think for a guy like him, not that I'm a crisis management lawyer, but I don't think it's happening anytime soon. I think he'd have to really, get past the trial, pay a lot of dues, make a lot of apologies, and do the types of things that are so extraordinary that people recognize, hey, maybe he's not all evil. But it's going to start off pretty difficult if he gets convicted on this case.
Well, this is something that we will for sure be following. Jim, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure. Yeah, great talking to you.
Sean Combs denies all allegations. For all of the Diddy trial coverage, you can watch our live shows every weekday at 12 noon Eastern and continue to follow our uploads right here on the Law and Crime YouTube channel. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.